that door, Nadia said, and she said it so fast the words nearly ran together. Do-Hyun's hand was already on the handle. He stopped anyway, because in 11 years he had learned exactly one unbreakable rule in his own house, and it was hers. 3 men were waiting on the other side of that door. He found that out 4 minutes later, after his security team cleared the room and found the wire, the guns, and the exact chair where he would have been sitting if he had walked through when he wanted to. Nadia was already back at the kitchen table, finishing her homework like she had not just saved her father's life for the 3rd time that year. A man who once tried to hand this child off to strangers before she was even a week old is alive today only because she refused to let him walk through a door. Tell me, do you think her instincts are something she was born with? Or something this house full of danger taught her the hard way? Drop where you are watching from tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe now. It means a lot to us. Now, back to our story. The rain came down in sheets the night everything began, 11 years before Nadia ever stopped her father at a door, hammering against the tall iron gates of the Kang estate with a force that seemed almost deliberate, as though the sky itself were trying to announce something no one inside was prepared to hear. Security footage would later show a woman moving quickly along the perimeter wall just after midnight, her face obscured by a hood, carrying a bundle wrapped tight against the weather. She did not linger. She moved with the practiced urgency of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times in her mind, checking once over her shoulder before setting the bundle down carefully in the small alcove beside the gate's call box. She pressed the intercom once, held it a beat longer than necessary, and disappeared into the dark before anyone reached the door, leaving no trace behind her except wet footprints already dissolving in the downpour. "Mr. Kang," the night guard said, standing in the estate's front hall dripping rainwater onto the polished marble floor, holding the bundle awkwardly against his chest, as though uncertain how to carry something so small and so alive. "There is something you need to see." Do-Hyun looked up from the ledgers spread across his desk, irritation flashing across his sharp features at the interruption. He had been reviewing quarterly shipping figures for the better part of 2 hours, and the sound of the front door opening at this hour, in this weather, had already put him in a foul mood before the guard even reached his study. "This had better be worth the state of my floor," he said, setting down his pen with visible impatience. The guard set the bundle down carefully on the nearest chair, and pulled back the wet blanket, revealing a newborn, no more than a few days old, her small face scrunched against the sudden light, a thin cry finally breaking free from her tiny lungs, growing steadily louder as the cold air of the study reached her skin. Do-Hyun rose from his desk slowly, staring at the child as though she might be some kind of elaborate trick, some test he had not yet identified the rules of. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice sharp, each word clipped short. "Left at the gate, sir," the guard said, still holding himself rigidly at attention despite the water pooling around his boots. There was a note. And this. He held out a small gold bracelet, delicate and clearly old, the kind of piece that had been handled and treasured for years before it ever reached this house, along with a folded piece of paper gone soft and slightly translucent from the rain. Do-Hyun took both, reading the note twice before setting it down on his desk with the careful precision of a man handling something he did not want to touch longer than absolutely necessary. "Get Choi," he said, his eyes still fixed on the note. His head of security arrived within minutes, his own hair still damp from having been roused from bed, and Do-Hyun handed him the note without a word, watching his face for a reaction. Choi read it silently, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. "This name," Choi said slowly, glancing up. "Adebayo. He worked the southern shipping routes for us, 7 years ago, before the trouble with the Busan contracts. He died owing your father a considerable sum, if I recall correctly. I did not know he had a daughter." "Neither did I," Do-Hyun said, glancing at the child still crying softly in the chair, her small fists working against the air. "Apparently my father's debts have a longer memory than my father did. The note says the mother could not keep her," Choi said, scanning it a second time. "That she is asking the Kang family to honor whatever obligation remains, in the child's name, since Adebayo never lived to repay it himself. Do-Hyun crossed his arms, studying the baby with the detached curiosity of a man examining an unfamiliar object left mistakenly on his doorstep. "This is not how debts get repaid," he said, his tone flat and final. "A dead man's daughter is not currency, Choi. This is someone's idea of leverage, dressed up as sentiment, and I have no intention of being sentimental about a stranger's mistake." Choi said nothing at first, watching his employer carefully, the way he often did when he suspected Do-Hyun was about to make a decision he would not easily undo. A habit born of 15 years spent learning exactly which of his employer's moods could still be reasoned with. "What do you want done with her?" Choi asked finally, his voice careful. Do-Hyun was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes moving from the child to the note and back again, something flickering briefly behind his controlled expression, before vanishing entirely. "I am not running a nursery," he said. "Contact a placement agency in the morning. A reputable one, discreet. I want this handled quietly and quickly, before word of this reaches anyone outside this house." "Sir," Choi said carefully, glancing toward the still crying infant. "She is an infant. In this weather, tonight, we cannot simply hide." "I did not ask for a debate," Do-Hyun said, cutting him off, his voice cold enough that Choi straightened instinctively. "Have the housekeeper see to her comfort tonight, if it is truly necessary. Tomorrow, this is no longer my problem, and I expect it will be handled before I sit down at this desk again." Choi hesitated, something unreadable passing across his face. But he nodded once and lifted the child carefully from the chair, cradling her with far more ease and gentleness than a man his size and profession might have been expected to manage, as though some part of him had already decided something Do-Hyun had not. "She has your father's temper already," Choi said, glancing down at her renewed, insistent crying. "Perhaps that is fitting, given the family she was left with tonight." Do-Hyun did not answer. He returned to his desk, to his ledgers, to the numbers that made sense to him in a way very little else in his life did, and he did not look up again as Choi carried the child from the room, her cries fading slowly down the hallway. The housekeeper, an older woman named Miss An, who had served the Kang household for over 2 decades, appeared in the doorway of Do-Hyun's study late that night, the baby finally quiet in her arms, wrapped now in a dry blanket pulled fresh from the linen closet. "She has taken a bottle," Miss An said, her voice soft but carrying easily across the quiet study. "She is settled for now, but sir, if I may—" "You may not," Do-Hyun said, without looking up from his papers, his pen moving steadily across a column of figures. Miss An remained in the doorway regardless, a woman who had outlasted enough of Do-Hyun's moods over the years to know precisely when his sharpness was worth ignoring entirely. "This child has no one else tonight," she said quietly, her tone carrying the particular patience of someone who had raised him nearly as much as his own mother once had. "Whatever you decide tomorrow, tonight she is under this roof, and I would ask that you at least look at her once, before you send her away to strangers, who will never know her at all." Do-Hyun set down his pen, exhaling slowly, and looked up at last, meeting the housekeeper's steady gaze rather than the child's, deliberately avoiding the small bundle still cradled in her arms. "I do not need to look at her to make a decision about her placement," he said, his voice hard. "Sentiment is not a foundation for responsible choices, Ms. An. I would think you, of all people, would understand that after everything this family has weathered over the years." Miss An's expression did not change, though something in her tired eyes suggested she disagreed entirely, and had disagreed with him plenty of times before without ever quite winning the argument. "As you wish, sir," she said finally, and carried the child away toward the guest wing, her footsteps unhurried, leaving Do-Hyun alone with his ledgers, and the quiet, insistent rain still striking hard against the windows. He did not sleep well that night, though he would never have admitted the reason why to anyone, least of all himself, and by morning, when Choi returned to confirm that a placement agency had been contacted and arrangements were already quietly underway, Do-Hyun simply nodded once, already turning his attention back to the shipping contracts awaiting his signature, a man determined to treat the entire matter as though it had never happened at all, as though a child's cry in the night could be filed away as easily as a cancelled order. Choi returned to the study 3 days later with an expression Do-Hyun had learned, over years of working together, to read as trouble before a single word left his mouth. "The placement agency," Choi said, closing the study door behind him with more care than usual. "It is not what it appeared to be." Do-Hyun did not look up from the contract he was reviewing. "Explain," he said. "I had one of our people run a deeper background check before finalizing the transfer. Standard procedure for anything involving the family name," Choi said. "The agency's primary funding traces back through 2 shell companies to the Song family." Do-Hyun's pen stopped moving. He set it down slowly, finally looking up. "The Songs," he repeated. Choi nodded. "If we had gone through with the placement, the child would have ended up in a home the Songs control entirely, raised by people reporting directly back to them. Given the note left with her, given whose daughter she is, I do not think that arrangement would have been an accident." Do-Hyun sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening as the pieces settled into place. "They wanted her as leverage from the beginning," he said. "Someone tipped them off the moment she was left here. It is possible the agency itself was never a coincidence," Choi said. "It is possible whoever left her at our gate did not choose that agency by chance either, sir. There may be more people watching this situation than either of us realized 3 nights ago." Do-Hyun was quiet for a long moment, staring at the closed door of his study, as though he could see straight through it to wherever the child was currently being kept. "Cancel the placement entirely," he said finally, his voice flat. "Effective immediately. I want no further contact with that agency or anyone connected to it." "And in the meantime," Choi asked carefully, "what do you want done with her?" Do-Hyun exhaled sharply through his nose, clearly unhappy with the position he now found himself in. "She stays here," he said, as though the words cost him something physical to say. "Temporarily. Until I identify a placement that is not compromised. Have Ms. An continue managing her care. I do not want to be consulted on the details." Choi nodded once, though something in his expression suggested he suspected temporarily might prove a great deal longer than his employer currently believed, and left the study without further comment. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm within the Kang household. Do-Hyun maintained his distance from the nursery with the same discipline he applied to every other aspect of his life, structuring his days so that his path rarely crossed with the small, increasingly alert presence now occupying the East guest wing. Ms. An managed the child's care entirely, assisted by 2 additional staff members brought in specifically for the purpose, and Do-Hyun signed off on invoices for formula, clothing, and pediatric visits with the same detached efficiency he applied to shipping manifests, never once asking to see receipts beyond what his accounting required. "He has not held her once," Ms. An mentioned to Choi one evening in the kitchen, her voice carrying the particular disapproval of a woman who had watched this family raise its share of difficult men. 3 weeks, and he has not so much as looked at her directly since that first night. "He is protecting himself," Choi said, though he did not sound entirely convinced of his own explanation. "Men like him do not let themselves get attached to things they intend to give away eventually." Ms. An made a small, disbelieving sound in her throat. "Then perhaps he should decide faster whether he intends to give her away at all," she said, "because this house is already beginning to feel less temporary than he believes it is." The matter of the child's name became its own quiet point of tension as the weeks stretched on. Ms. An and the household staff had taken, out of simple practical necessity, to calling her various soft, temporary names among themselves, but none of it was official, and the lack of an actual name recorded anywhere began to complicate matters beyond the merely sentimental. The pediatrician's office required one for their files. The staff scheduling required something more permanent than the baby scrawled across duty rosters. Even Choi's own security logs, tracking who entered and exited the East Wing, had begun to look faintly absurd, listing an unnamed infant as a person of interest in his reports. "Sir," Ms. An said one morning, catching Do-Hyun in the hallway outside his study before he could retreat behind its closed door. "We require a name for her records, The clinic has asked twice now. I cannot continue telling them we are still deciding. Do-Hyun's jaw tightened, the particular expression of a man being cornered into an intimacy he had spent weeks carefully avoiding. She does not need a name from me, he said. Whatever her mother intended to call her, use that instead. There was no name given in the note, Ms. An said gently. Only the bracelet and the debt. Whatever she is called from this point forward, sir, it will need to come from someone in this house, because she cannot remain unnamed indefinitely. It is not right for a child. Do-Hyun stood in the hallway for a long moment, saying nothing, his eyes drifting almost involuntarily toward the east wing before he caught himself and looked away again. Give me the day, he said finally, his voice tight. I will have something by evening. He did not, in fact, spend the day thinking about it the way he told himself he would. He buried himself instead in a dispute over dock fees in Incheon, in a call with his father's old attorney regarding an unrelated matter entirely, in anything that kept his mind occupied with problems that had clean, logical solutions. It was not until nearly midnight, alone in his study, with the house gone quiet around him, that he found himself standing in the doorway of the nursery for the first time since that first rainy night, watching Ms. An settle the child into her crib for the evening. She startled slightly at his presence, clearly not expecting him. Sir, she said, straightening. Is something wrong? You said you needed a name, Do-Hyun said, his eyes fixed on the child rather than the housekeeper, watching her small chest rise and fall in the dim light. Ms. An stepped back slightly, giving him space, saying nothing further, sensing correctly that any interruption now might close whatever door had briefly opened. Do-Hyun stood there a long moment, studying the small, sleeping face in a way he had deliberately avoided doing for 3 weeks, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual hard edge, though it remained careful, guarded, a man testing the weight of a decision before fully committing to it. Nadia, he said finally. It was my grandmother's name. She was not a sentimental woman either, but she survived things that should have destroyed her. It seems, he added, more to himself than to Ms. An, an appropriate name for someone who has already survived being left at a gate in the rain. Ms. An's expression softened, though she was careful not to make too much of the moment, sensing that any visible emotion might send him retreating again. Nadia, she repeated softly, testing it. It suits her. Do-Hyun did not respond. He remained in the doorway a moment longer, watching the child sleep, before turning and walking back toward his study without another word, leaving Miss An alone with the small, newly named girl in the quiet nursery, the first crack, however small, finally showing in the careful distance he had spent 3 weeks constructing around himself. By the time Nadia turned 4, the Kang estate had become the only world she had ever known, a place of high walls and quiet men in dark suits, of rooms she was allowed into and rooms she understood, without ever being explicitly told, to avoid entirely. The estate itself sprawled across acres of carefully maintained grounds, gated and monitored at every entrance, a fortress dressed up as a family home, and Nadia moved through it, the way other children moved through ordinary houses, except that her understanding of the space had been shaped from infancy by an atmosphere of quiet, constant vigilance that most children never encountered at all. She grew up trailing after Miss An through the kitchen and the long marble hallways, watching the household's rhythms with the particular attentiveness of a child who had learned early that paying attention kept her safer than not paying attention. Ms. An taught her which staff members preferred quiet mornings and which welcomed conversation, which hallways stayed cold even in summer because of drafts no one had ever bothered fixing, and small domestic knowledge that any child might absorb given enough time in one place. But Choi had taken to teaching her other things during his rounds, things that went beyond ordinary domestic familiarity. How to identify the particular sound of a car engine before it turned fully into the drive, which doors stayed locked and which did not. Small lessons dressed up as games that she absorbed with unusual seriousness for a girl her age. You are going to make her paranoid before she is old enough for school, Ms. An told Choi one afternoon, watching Nadia carefully study the security monitors mounted in the hallway alcove, her small finger tracing the different camera feeds with focused, unblinking curiosity, as though memorizing the layout of the property one screen at a time. "I am going to make her careful," Choi said, not looking away from the monitors himself. "In this house, there is no difference between the two that matters, Ms. An. Better she learns it from me, gently, than learns it the hard way, the same way most of us did." Ms. An did not argue the point further, though her expression suggested she remained unconvinced, and she returned to her own work, leaving Nadia and Choi to their quiet lesson at the monitors. Do-Hyun, for his part, maintained a careful distance that had become its own kind of routine over 4 years, present in the house but rarely present in her days, a man who signed off on her schooling arrangements and her wardrobe budget. With the same efficient detachment he applied to shipping contracts and dock fees, while leaving the actual raising of her to Miss An, to Choi, to the rotating staff who moved through the estate's daily operations with far more warmth toward the child than her own father seemed able to manage. He ate dinner separately from her most nights, his schedule structured deliberately, though he would never have admitted it as deliberate, around meetings that ran late into the evening, ensuring their paths crossed only rarely. On the occasions his schedule did bring him home before her bedtime, he retreated quickly to his study, rather than lingering in the parts of the house where he might encounter her, and on the rare occasions their paths crossed in the hallway despite his efforts. His interactions with her remained brief and formal, the exchanges of a landlord checking politely on a tenant rather than a father with his own daughter. "Good evening, Appa," she said to him once, catching him in the front hall as he removed his coat, testing the word carefully, watching his face closely for a reaction the way she watched everything else in the house, cataloging it for later. Do-Hyun paused mid-motion, something flickering briefly across his composed features before he schooled it back into neutrality, a practiced skill he had spent years perfecting in far more dangerous rooms than his own front hall. "Good evening, Nadia," he said, and continued past her toward his study without further comment, his footsteps unhurried but final, leaving her standing alone in the hallway, watching him go with an expression far too composed and unsurprised for a child her age. She did not try the word again for several months after that, and if anyone in the household noticed, they did not mention it aloud, though Miss An's expression tightened visibly whenever the subject of Do-Hyun's absence came up in conversation among the staff. It was around this time that the household staff first began noticing, in small, scattered ways that seemed insignificant individually, that Nadia possessed an attentiveness that went considerably beyond ordinary childhood curiosity. She was, by every account from the staff who spent their days with her, an unusually quiet child around certain visitors to the estate, retreating to corners or falling silent in ways that seemed disproportionate to anything visibly happening in the room around her. There was the afternoon a shipping partner named Mr. Beck visited for a business dinner, a jovial, loud man who made a show of kneeling down to greet her warmly in the front hall, producing a small wrapped candy from his pocket with practiced charm. Nadia, normally polite if reserved with guests, simply stared at him without responding, refusing even to accept the candy, and quietly excused herself to find Miss An in the kitchen, refusing to return to the dining room for the remainder of the evening, despite being asked twice by staff sent to retrieve her. "She does not care for Mr. Beck," Ms. An reported to Choi afterward, mild concern coloring her voice as she recounted the incident. "I do not know why. He was perfectly pleasant to her, more pleasant than most of the men who come through this house." 6 weeks later, Mr. Beck was arrested for running an unrelated smuggling operation that had, according to the investigation that followed, been using Kang shipping routes without authorization for the better part of a year, funneling contraband through manifests no one had thought to double-check. Choi mentioned it to Do-Hyun in passing, more as an odd footnote worth a raised eyebrow than a matter of any real significance, and Do-Hyun dismissed it with a shrug, attributing the child's reaction to simple dislike of loud, overly familiar adults, nothing more worth examining. There were other moments too, small ones that individually meant nothing, but which began, slowly, to form a pattern the household staff noticed, even if Do-Hyun himself remained too occupied to pay close attention to any of it. Nadia memorized the names and faces of the household's rotating security detail faster than seemed reasonable for a child her age, greeting new hires by name within a single day of their arrival, and growing visibly wary of the two occasions when a new guard's polite manner did not quite match something in his eyes that only she seemed to register. She refused, at 5 years old, to eat anything prepared by a temporary kitchen assistant hired to cover Miss On's brief medical leave, insisting quietly but firmly that something about the woman's cooking smelled like the hospital, an observation the adults dismissed at the time as childish nonsense, until the assistant was later discovered to have been diverting medication from a nearby pharmacy through an elaborate scheme involving the estate's regular supply deliveries. "She just notices things," Choi said to Ms. On one evening, turning the accumulating small coincidences over in his mind with a security professional's particular discomfort at anything he could not fully explain through training or procedure. Most children her age are oblivious to half of what happens around them, distracted by toys and games. She is oblivious to none of it, not one detail. "It is this house," Ms. On said simply, folding a stack of towels with practiced efficiency. "She has never known anything but watching for danger, every single day of her life. Of course she notices things the rest of us miss entirely. We taught her to, whether either of us meant to or not." Do-Hyun remained largely unaware of these small, accumulating observations, occupied as he was with the daily demands of an organization that required his full attention nearly every waking hour of every day. When Choi occasionally mentioned some small incident involving Nadia's unusual perceptiveness, Do-Hyun typically offered only distracted acknowledgement before returning to whatever business matter currently held his focus, unwilling or perhaps simply unable to see the pattern forming quietly in his own household, because he had never once allowed himself to look closely enough to notice it forming at all. He continued to frame his relationship to her, in his own mind and occasionally aloud to Choi, in the careful language of obligation rather than affection. "She is provided for," he said once, when Choi gently suggested Do-Hyun might consider attending one of Nadia's school events, a small spring performance the other parents would certainly attend. "That is what matters most at her age. Children do not require their parents to be present at every small occasion, Choi. They require stability and resources, both of which she has in considerable abundance under this roof." Choi did not argue the point directly, though something tight in his expression suggested he disagreed considerably more than he was willing to voice openly to his employer. He simply nodded and let the matter drop, the way he had learned to let most matters concerning Nadia drop over the past 4 years, watching quietly as the girl grew increasingly attuned to a house full of secrets, while the man responsible for her continued treating her presence as a debt, being carefully managed, rather than a daughter being raised and loved. On the evening of Nadia's 5th birthday, a small, quiet affair organized entirely by Ms. On with a modest cake and a handful of household staff gathered warmly in the kitchen. Do-Hyun appeared briefly in the doorway, drawn there by the sound of singing he had not authorized or planned for, and had, in fact, entirely forgotten was happening that evening. He watched from the threshold for a long moment, saying nothing, as Nadia blew out 5 candles with the fierce, focused concentration of a child determined to do it perfectly on the first try, surrounded by people who were, in every practical sense that mattered, more her family in that moment than he had ever allowed himself to become in 5 years. She glanced up mid-celebration and caught him watching from the doorway, her expression unreadable in a way that unsettled him more than he would have admitted to anyone, and for one brief, suspended moment, something passed between them that neither of them acknowledged aloud, some small current of recognition, before Do-Hyun retreated quietly back toward his study, leaving the celebration to continue warmly without him, exactly as it had for every single year of her life so far. Nadia was 7 years old when a new driver named Mr. Yang joined the estate's rotating staff, hired through a recommendation from one of Do-Hyun's business associates. His references thorough enough that Choi had approved the hire without the deeper scrutiny he might normally have applied to someone new to the household. She disliked him from the first afternoon, though she could not, at 7, articulate precisely why in language the adults around her found convincing. He told Ms. On he grew up near the harbor district, she said, sitting at the kitchen table while Ms. An prepared dinner, but he does not know which way the ferry terminal faces. Everyone who grew up there knows which way it faces. I asked him twice. Ms. An, only half listening while she chopped vegetables, offered a distracted response. Perhaps he simply does not remember well, she said. Not everyone pays attention to things the way you do, Nadia. He also has a scar on his hand, shaped like the ones the security men get from handling wire, Nadia continued, undeterred. But he told Choi he used to work in a restaurant kitchen. Restaurant scars look different. I have seen both kinds on people who come through here. Ms. An paused her chopping this time, glancing toward the girl with slightly more attention, though still more amused than alarmed. That is a very specific thing to notice, she said. I notice specific things, Nadia said simply, as though this were the most obvious fact in the world. When Nadia repeated her concerns to Choi later that evening, catching him during his rounds through the kitchen corridor, he listened with more patience than Ms. An had, crouching down to her eye level, the way he always did when she brought him something she considered important. But his conclusion, in the end, was much the same. His references checked out thoroughly, Choi said gently. Sometimes people misremember small details, or exaggerate a little, to seem more interesting during an interview. It happens more than you would think. It does not always mean something is wrong. But it could, Nadia said, refusing to let the matter go as easily as the adults around her seemed to want. It could, Choi agreed, because he had learned over the years never to dismiss her entirely, even when he found himself unconvinced. I will keep an eye on him a little more closely. Will that satisfy you for now? It did not, entirely, but Nadia understood by 7 that there was a limit to how many times the adults around her would take her seriously in a single week, and she let the matter rest, though she continued watching Mr. Yang herself with the quiet, careful attention she had learned from Choi, without ever being explicitly taught. 3 weeks later, on an evening when Do-Hyun was scheduled to attend a dinner meeting at a restaurant across the city, Mr. Yang was assigned as his driver for the night, a routine rotation that raised no particular flags with anyone reviewing the schedule. Nadia found Choi in the security office that afternoon, having overheard the arrangement during dinner preparations, her expression more insistent than it had been in weeks. "Do not let him drive Appa tonight," she said, without preamble. Choi glanced up from his monitors, his patience visibly thinning after weeks of her recurring concerns about a man who had, by every measure available to him, performed his duties without incident. "Nadia," he said carefully, "we have discussed this. Mr. Yang has done nothing to warrant something as different tonight," she interrupted, an urgency in her voice that Choi had not heard from her before, not even during her earlier suspicions. He checked the car twice before Appe's meetings were even confirmed. He does not usually do that. He was on his phone in the garage for a long time, and he stopped talking when one of the other drivers walked past. Choi hesitated, something in her tone finally cutting through his accumulated skepticism, though not entirely. "I will review the garage cameras," he said. "But the car is already scheduled, and I cannot simply pull a driver on a feeling, Nadia, yours or mine. I need something more concrete before I can act." Nadia's small hands clenched at her sides, frustration written plainly across her face. "Then watch the cameras fast," she said, and turned and left the security office without waiting for his response, her footsteps quick and determined down the hallway toward Do-Hyun's study. She found her father preparing for his evening meeting, adjusting his cufflinks in front of the hallway mirror much the way he did most evenings, and she stopped in the doorway, hesitating only briefly before speaking. "Do not go with Mr. Yang tonight," she said. Do-Hyun glanced at her reflection in the mirror, mild surprise crossing his features at the directness of the statement, though not alarm, not yet. "Nadia," he said, his tone carrying the particular patience he reserved for matters he considered beneath serious discussion, "I have a great deal happening this evening. I do not have time for something is wrong with him," she said, cutting him off with an urgency that made Do-Hyun finally turn fully to face her, rather than addressing her reflection. "I told Choi. I told Ms. An. Nobody listens because I am 7, but I am telling you now, and you should listen, because it is your car and your life, not theirs." Do-Hyun studied her for a long moment, something in her expression giving him pause despite his instinct to dismiss the concern as easily as everyone else had. He had learned, over 7 years of living alongside her, that she rarely pushed this hard on anything, and the sheer insistence in her small, steady voice unsettled him more than he expected it to. "What, specifically, has concerned you?" he asked finally, his voice more measured now, genuinely asking rather than humoring her. She recounted it quickly, the inconsistent story about the harbor district, the scar that did not match his stated history, the unusual behavior in the garage that afternoon, the words tumbling out faster than her usual careful precision, as though she feared running out of time before he stopped listening. Do-Hyun was quiet for a long moment after she finished, weighing her words against 7 years of watching her notice things that consistently, unnervingly, turned out to matter. "Choi is reviewing the garage footage now," she added, when he did not respond immediately. "He said he needed something concrete. I do not know if that is concrete enough for him." Do-Hyun set down the cufflink he had been holding. "Wait here," he said, and walked briskly toward the security office, Nadia trailing a few steps behind him despite not being asked to follow. Choi looked up as they entered, his expression grim in a way that told Do-Hyun everything before a single word was spoken. "Sir," Choi said, gesturing toward the monitor in front of him, replaying a grainy clip of the garage from earlier that afternoon. "I found this 10 minutes ago. I was about to come find you." The footage showed Mr. Yang, alone in the garage, kneeling briefly beside the rear wheel well of Do-Hyun's car, his movements quick and practiced, before straightening and walking away as another staff member entered the frame. "I sent someone to inspect the vehicle the moment I saw this," Choi said. They found a tracking device magnetically attached beneath the wheel well, along with early signs of tampering near the brake line. Incomplete, but clearly beginning. If he had finished the job before tonight's drive just. "He did not finish," Do-Hyun said quietly, staring at the frozen frame on the screen. "Because she noticed something was wrong 3 weeks before any of the rest of us did," Choi said, glancing briefly at Nadia, who stood quietly in the doorway, watching the exchange with an expression far too composed for what had just been confirmed. "I should have listened sooner, sir. I take responsibility for that delay." Do-Hyun did not respond immediately. He turned instead to look at his daughter, really look at her, in a way he had rarely allowed himself to do in 7 years, and something in his chest tightened uncomfortably, a mixture of gratitude and fear, so unfamiliar he did not immediately recognize either sensation for what it was. "Where is Mr. Yang now?" Do-Hyun asked, his voice low. "Detained," Choi said. "He has not been informed why yet. I wanted your instruction before proceeding further." Do-Hyun nodded once, still watching Nadia, who had not moved from the doorway, her small hands still clenched slightly at her sides, as though the adrenaline of being right had not yet fully left her body. "Thank you," he said finally, the words unfamiliar and slightly stiff in his mouth, directed at her rather than at Choi. Nadia studied him for a moment, as though weighing whether the gratitude was genuine or simply relief speaking. "You should have listened the first time I said something," she said, not unkindly, but with the plain honesty of a child who had not yet learned to soften difficult truths for adults. Then Choi would not have had to find it on camera at the last minute. Do-Hyun had no immediate answer for that, and something in his expression, caught between the discomfort of being corrected by a 7-year-old and the dawning, unwelcome realization of exactly how much he had been underestimating her, remained with him long after he finally left for his rescheduled meeting that evening, driven instead by Choi personally, in a different car entirely. Nadia was 9 years old when her relationship with Choi, the man who had taught her to read license plates before she could read her own school books, began to change in ways that unsettled everyone in the household who noticed it. It started small enough that Ms. An almost dismissed it entirely, a flinch when Choi entered a room too quickly, a reluctance to sit beside him at the kitchen table, where she had once claimed her spot next to him without thinking twice. Within a few weeks, the flinch had become something closer to avoidance, Nadia finding reasons to leave whenever Choi's rounds brought him through wherever she happened to be. She used to follow him everywhere, Ms. An said to Do-Hyun one evening, catching him in a rare moment between meetings. Now she will not stay in a room with him longer than a few minutes. I asked her why. She would not say. Do-Hyun frowned, setting down the folder he had been reviewing. Did something happen between them? He asked. Not that I have seen, Miss An said. But you know how she is. If something felt wrong to her, she would not need a reason beyond that. Do-Hyun found Nadia later that evening in the small study she had claimed as her own over the years. A room originally intended for storage that had slowly filled with books and the careful, organized clutter of a child who catalogued everything around her. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded in a way that had become less common between them since the incident with Mr. Yang 2 years earlier. Ms. An tells me you have been avoiding Choi, Do-Hyun said, settling into the chair across from her desk. Nadia did not answer immediately, her fingers tracing the edge of the book in her lap. He feels different, she said finally. Different how? Do-Hyun asked, careful now to keep the impatience out of his voice that he might once have let slip without thinking. I do not know how to explain it better than that, she said, frustration creeping into her voice. He talks to me the same. He acts the same around everyone else. But something about him feels like the wrong answer to a question nobody has asked yet. I know that does not make sense. Do-Hyun was quiet for a long moment, remembering the garage, the tracking device, the 2 years of small vindications that had slowly, reluctantly taught him to take her instincts seriously, even when they arrived without evidence attached. Has he done anything, said anything, that concerned you specifically? He asked. Nadia shook her head. No, she said. That is what makes it hard. There is nothing to point to. I just do not want to be alone with him anymore. And I do not know how to make that feel like a good enough reason to the rest of you. Do-Hyun did not dismiss her, though he did not immediately act on her concerns either. Uncertain what action could reasonably follow a feeling, with no supporting evidence, directed at a man who had served him loyally for over 15 years. He left her study that evening carrying an unease he could not fully articulate himself, and it was this unease, more than any specific suspicion, that led him quietly to request a routine financial audit across his senior staff's accounts the following week. A precaution he told himself was unrelated to his daughter's discomfort, though he did not entirely believe his own reasoning. The audit took 3 weeks to complete. Do-Hyun received the results on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered personally by the accountant who had conducted it, a cautious man who requested the meeting take place with the door closed and no assistants present. Mr. Kang, the accountant said, sliding a folder across the desk. I would have brought this to you sooner, but I wanted to be certain before raising something this serious. Do-Hyun opened the folder, scanning the figures inside, his expression darkening steadily as he worked through the pages. Explain this to me plainly, he said. 3 shell accounts, the accountant said. None registered directly under Choi's name, but each traceable back to him through property records and a secondary phone line billed to an address he owns but does not live at. Deposits totaling a significant sum over the past 18 months, originating from accounts we have linked to the Song family's financial network. Do-Hyun set the folder down slowly, his jaw tight. How long have you known? He asked. I confirmed it 4 days ago, the accountant said. I wanted to be certain before bringing you something that serious about a man in his position. Do-Hyun sat in silence for a long moment after the accountant left, staring at the folder on his desk, thinking not of the financial evidence in front of him, but of his daughter's voice 2 weeks earlier, careful and frustrated, trying to explain a feeling she could not fully articulate about a man everyone else in the house had trusted without question for 15 years. He confronted Choi that same evening, in the same study where he had once dismissed a housekeeper's plea to look at an unnamed infant, the room having witnessed, over the years, most of the family's harder conversations. Sit down, Do-Hyun said, when Choi entered, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. Choi's expression shifted slightly at the tone, though he sat without argument. Sir, he said carefully, is something wrong? Do-Hyun slid the folder across the desk without a word, watching Choi's face as he opened it. watching the careful composure Choi had maintained through 15 years of crises slowly crack as he understood exactly what he was looking at. Do-Hyun, Choi said quietly, using his given name for what might have been the first time in over a decade of formal address. A small, telling slip. How long? Do-Hyun said, echoing the question he had asked the accountant, though the words came harder this time. Directed at a man he had trusted with far more than money over the years. 18 months, Choi admitted, his voice unsteady in a way Do-Hyun had genuinely never heard from him before. Not in the worst of their earlier conflicts, not even during the tense years following Do-Hyun's father's death. My brother's debts. Gambling, mostly, though it hardly matters now what started it. The songs approached me quietly, offered to clear what he owed. All I had to do was pass along scheduling, security patterns, small things I told myself would never actually put anyone at real risk. You told them about the car that night, Do-Hyun said, the realization arriving cold and sudden. Mr. Yang, that was not a coincidence hire, was it? Choi's silence answered the question before his words did. I did not know they intended to go that far, he said finally. I believed it was surveillance, information gathering, nothing more. When I realized what Yang had actually been sent to do, I was the one who flagged the garage footage for review. I want you to know that. I could have buried it. I did not. Do-Hyun's hands curled into fists on the desk, the betrayal settling into him with a weight he had not expected, sharper somehow than any threat he had faced from outside his own household in years. You sat in this house, he said, his voice low and dangerous now. You held her when she was an infant. You taught her to identify car engines before she could read. And the entire time, you were selling information to people who would have killed her without hesitation if it served their purposes. I know, Choi said, and for the first time in Do-Hyun's memory, the man looked genuinely, entirely broken. I told myself it would never reach her. I told myself I could control exactly how far it went. I was wrong about all of it, and I have known I was wrong for months, and I did not know how to undo it once it started. She knew, Do-Hyun said quietly, more to himself than to Choi. She has known for weeks. She could not tell me why. She just knew something about you had changed, and I nearly convinced myself it was nothing. Choi said nothing further, his head bowed, waiting for whatever judgment was coming, the particular stillness of a man who had spent 15 years around violence, fully expecting it might finally be turned on him. Do-Hyun sat with the silence for a long moment, his fury and his grief tangled together in a way that made clear thought difficult. He thought of Nadia, 9 years old, carefully avoiding a man she could not fully explain her fear of, trusting an instinct the adults around her had spent years, slowly, painfully learning to take seriously. He thought of Choi carrying her as an infant, teaching her to read the world safely, and betraying that same trust for a debt he had been too proud or too afraid to bring to Do-Hyun honestly. I am not going to kill you, Do-Hyun said finally, and something in Choi's shoulders sagged with visible, disbelieving relief. But you will leave this house tonight, and you will not return. Whatever remains of your brother's debt, I will not clear it for you, and I do not want to know how you resolve it. If I learn you have made any further contact with the songs, or with anyone in this family, the mercy I am showing you tonight will not extend a second time. Thank you, Choi said quietly, rising slowly from his chair. Do not thank me, Do-Hyun said. I am not doing this for you. I am doing it because she trusted you once, entirely, and some part of her will always remember that, whatever you did to break it. I will not take more from her than you already have. Choi left the estate before midnight, and Do-Hyun did not watch him go, remaining instead in his study, long after the house had gone quiet, turning over the full weight of what had nearly happened, and the small, stubborn 9-year-old voice that had tried, weeks earlier, to warn him before any of it became necessary at all. He found Nadia awake later that night, sitting up in bed with a book she was not really reading, and he sat down at the edge of her bed for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember. Choi will not be here anymore, he said simply. Nadia studied his face for a long moment, understanding settling over her features without him needing to explain further, the particular clarity of a child who had already sensed the shape of the truth before anyone confirmed it aloud. "I am sorry," she said quietly, and he understood she meant it, despite everything. "You do not need to apologize," Do-Hyun said. "You tried to tell me. I should have listened the first time, the way I am learning to now." Nadia was quiet for a moment, considering this. "Are you going to listen faster next time?" she asked, with the plain, unguarded directness that had unsettled him from the very first day she had spoken to him with any confidence at all. "I am going to try," Do-Hyun said, and for the first time since the night she was left crying at his gate, he reached out and rested his hand gently over hers, an unfamiliar, deliberate gesture that neither of them commented on, though neither of them pulled away from it either. A woman was spotted outside the estate gates on a Thursday evening, standing motionless in the rain, much the way the estate's own security footage had once captured another woman doing, nearly a decade earlier, though this time the guards noticed her within minutes rather than hours, the estate's protocols having tightened considerably in the years since Choi's departure. "She has been there over 3 hours, sir," the new head of security, a careful, methodical man named Park, who had taken over Choi's former responsibilities 6 months earlier, reported to Do-Hyun that evening, standing stiffly in the study doorway, with a tablet displaying the live gate feed. "She has not attempted to approach the gate, has not made any calls that our equipment has detected, has not moved from the same spot beneath the street lamp since she arrived. She simply stands there, watching the house." Do-Hyun set down the report he had been reading, something uneasy settling in his chest at the description. An echo of a night he had spent years trying not to think about too closely. A night that had begun with rain, and a bundle left at his gate, and had somehow, gradually, reshaped the entire architecture of his life since. "Bring her in," he said, carefully. "I want to speak with her myself, and I want 2 of your men in the room, out of sight but close enough to respond." "Understood, sir," Park said, and left to arrange it. The woman did not resist when Park's men approached her, allowing herself to be escorted through the gate without protest, her expression calm in a way that unsettled the guards more than fear would have, several of them exchanging uncertain glances as they walked her toward the main house. She was perhaps in her late 40s, her dark hair pulled back neatly, despite the rain that had soaked through her coat, her clothing simple but well kept, the posture of someone who had once carried herself with considerably more confidence than the circumstances currently allowed her to show. When she was brought into the same private room Do-Hyun had once used for exactly this kind of conversation years earlier, the room where he had first questioned a woman named Fola in another version of this same story that had never actually happened to him, she sat down without being asked, folding her hands calmly in her lap, waiting. "I know why you have brought me here," she said, before Do-Hyun had spoken a single word, her voice steady despite the hours she had spent standing in the cold rain. "You want to know why I was standing outside your gate?" Do-Hyun studied her carefully, remaining standing while she sat, his posture deliberately unyielding. "That would be a reasonable place to start," he said. "My name is Camille," the woman said. "I have been looking for a child for 11 years. I believe she is living in this house, and I believe, if I am honest with you, that some part of me already knew that before I ever arrived here tonight." Do-Hyun's expression did not change, though something tightened behind his eyes, a stillness he had learned, over years of negotiations far more dangerous than this one, to maintain, even when his composure was genuinely tested. "What is your relationship to this child?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Her mother, Ines, was my younger sister," Camille said. "I raised her, in many ways, after our parents passed, though I was only a few years older myself. She died 9 years ago, in circumstances I still do not fully understand, though I have spent most of the years since trying to piece them together from fragments, from rumors, from people who would only tell me half of what they knew. Before she died, she told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should not look for the baby directly. She told me the child would be safest if I let whoever was protecting her continue to believe she had simply disappeared, vanished without a trace, no loose threads for anyone to follow. Do-Hyun crossed his arms, his composure carefully maintained, despite the growing unease building steadily in his chest, a feeling he recognized now, after years of learning to trust discomfort rather than dismiss it, as significant. "If your sister wanted the child protected," he said, "why come looking now, after 9 years of apparently honoring that wish so carefully?" "Because 3 months ago," Camille said, her hands tightening slightly in her lap, "I received a message from someone claiming to represent people my sister once owed a debt to. Not a financial debt, something older, something tangled up in old grievances between families I still do not fully understand myself. They know the child survived, they know, or at least strongly suspect, where she has been raised for the past 9 years. I came here not to take her from you, Mr. Kang. I came here because I believe you are the only person capable of protecting her from what is coming, and I needed to know, finally, whether she was even still alive before I decided what to do next with what I had learned." Do-Hyun was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this, his mind working through the implications with the same careful attention he applied to any serious threat against his organization. Except this threat, he understood now, had been circling his daughter's existence since before he had ever agreed to keep her under his roof at all, since before she had even been born, perhaps. "Tell me about her mother," he said finally, pulling a chair around to sit across from Camille rather than continuing to stand over her. "Everything. I have spent 9 years knowing almost nothing beyond a note and a debt scrawled on a piece of paper gone soft with rain." Camille studied him for a long moment, as though weighing how much trust his question had actually earned in the span of a single conversation. "Ines worked for a family," she said finally, "connected distantly to yours, through business dealings that predate either of us by at least a generation. She fell in love with a man named Adebayo, the man whose name was left with the child, and their relationship put both of them in a difficult position, with people who did not approve of the alliance quietly forming between two organizations that had spent years maintaining careful, deliberate distance from one another, for reasons neither of them fully understood at the time. "The songs?" Do-Hyun said quietly, the name settling into the room like something cold. Camille nodded slowly. "Adebayo owed your family a debt from years before, unrelated originally to any of this, a simple matter of business gone wrong, nothing more. But when the relationship between him and my sister became known to the wrong people, certain individuals realized that debt could be used as leverage, a way to ensure that if anything ever happened to either parent, the child would end up somewhere specific, somewhere they could eventually reach her, through the very obligation your family already held on paper." Do-Hyun's jaw tightened, understanding arriving in slow, unwelcome pieces. "They intended for her to become leverage against my family specifically," he said. "Not simply against her parents, not simply a debt collected. A weapon aimed at me, planted before I ever knew it existed. That is my belief, yes," Camille said. "Ines understood the danger before Adebayo ever fully did, or perhaps she simply understood it more urgently. When he died, she made the decision, alone, in what I can only imagine was terror and grief in equal measure, that leaving the child with your family, publicly tied to an old, simple debt rather than any hidden relationship, was safer than any alternative she could arrange herself in the time she had left. She believed the Kang family's protection and its reputation, its sheer visibility, would deter anyone from reaching the child as long as the true connection to Adebayo's actual relationship with her remained hidden entirely. She never told me any of this in the note," Do-Hyun said, his voice quieter now. "Only the debt. A few sentences, nothing more. Because if she had explained fully," Camille said gently, "and that note had ever fallen into the wrong hands before it reached you, it would have told the very people hunting her exactly what they needed to know, exactly where to look and why. The debt was covered, Mr. Kang, a story simple enough, ordinary enough, to protect a truth far too dangerous to ever put in writing." Do-Hyun sat with that for a long moment, the years of carefully maintained distance from his daughter's origins suddenly collapsing under the weight of a story far more deliberate, far more desperate than he had ever allowed himself to imagine, during 9 years of treating her presence as an inconvenient inheritance rather than the product of a mother's final, sacrificial act of love. "Why are the songs surfacing again now, after 9 years of silence?" he asked, needing something concrete to hold on to amid everything else shifting beneath him. Camille's expression darkened slightly. "I do not know for certain," she admitted. "But debts like this rarely disappear entirely, whatever anyone hopes. Perhaps something changed within their organization, a shift in leadership, a need for new leverage against you specifically. Perhaps someone simply, finally, connected pieces that had remained scattered and dormant for years. I only know that the message I received was specific enough, detailed enough about things only someone with real information could have known, to convince me the danger is genuine and close, and that whatever protection you have provided her for 9 years may no longer be sufficient entirely on its own going forward." Do-Hyun was quiet for a long moment, turning the full weight of this over in his mind. Years of treating Nadia's presence as an obligation, now colliding directly with the growing, undeniable understanding that she had never simply been a debt at all, but a deliberate act of desperate love from a mother who had sacrificed her own presence in her daughter's life to keep her alive against odds she must have known were terrible. "What do you want from me?" Do-Hyun asked finally. The question was genuine rather than defensive for the first time in the conversation. "I want to know her," Camille said, her composed voice finally cracking slightly with something rawer beneath it. The first real crack in her careful presentation since she had sat down. "Carefully, on whatever terms you require, with whatever security you consider necessary, however slowly you need this to happen. I am not asking to take her from the only home she has ever known, Mr. Kang. I am asking for the chance to be something to her that I was not permitted to be for the first 9 years of her life. And I am asking you to let me help protect her. Because I believe, whatever else remains uncertain between us tonight, we both want the exact same outcome now." Do-Hyun studied her for a long moment, weighing 9 years of careful distrust against the particular, unmistakable grief in her expression. A grief that mirrored, in ways he found difficult to dismiss entirely, his own daughter's watchful, guarded nature. The same stillness he had watched Nadia carry her whole life without ever fully understanding where it came from. "I will allow supervised contact," he said finally. "Nothing more, not yet. Every visit will be monitored by my own people, on my property, on my terms. I will verify everything you have told me tonight, independently, before I extend any further trust beyond that baseline. And if I discover you have lied to me about any part of this story, tonight will be the last time you ever set foot on this property, whatever your intentions turn out to have been." "That is more than fair," Camille said, something like genuine relief passing briefly across her composed features, her shoulders loosening slightly for the first time since she had sat down. Do-Hyun rose from his chair, moving toward the door before pausing, his hand resting briefly on the frame, a question he had not intended to ask rising unexpectedly to the surface. "Does she look like her?" he asked, without turning around to face Camille directly. "Her mother." Camille was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "Around the eyes, mostly," she said softly. "The same way of looking at you a beat too long before she answers a question, as though she is deciding how much of the truth you can handle. But her stillness, the particular way she watches a room before she ever speaks in it, cataloging everything before revealing anything, that came from somewhere else entirely. I suspect that part of her, Mr. Kang, she learned from this house, from you, whether either of you realized it was happening." Do-Hyun did not respond to that directly, though something in his shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly as he left the room, walking slowly down the long hallway toward the east wing where his daughter, now 9 years old, and utterly unaware of the conversation that had just reshaped everything she thought she understood about her own beginning, was almost certainly still awake, reading long past the hour she was supposed to be asleep, entirely unaware that the quiet, careful world he had built around her had just grown considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous in the span of a single conversation. The attack came 11 days after Camille's first visit, on a night thick with fog rolling in off the harbor, timed, Do-Hyun would understand only later, to a maintenance window in the estate's security rotation that someone had studied carefully enough to exploit down to the minute. Nadia had been restless all evening, picking at her dinner, glancing repeatedly toward the windows in a way that Do-Hyun had learned over 11 years not to dismiss even when nothing seemed visibly wrong. "Something feels different tonight," she said, pushing her plate away only half finished. "Different how?" Do-Hyun asked, setting down his own fork, giving her his full attention the way he had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to do over the past 2 years. "I do not know," she admitted, frustration creasing her young face. "It is not one thing, it is everything. The house feels like it is holding its breath." Do-Hyun considered this for a moment, then rose from the table and reached for the security radio Park had insisted he carry at all times since Camille's revelations. "Park," he said, "increase the perimeter patrol tonight. Double the rotation on the east and west gates." "Understood, sir," Park's voice crackled back. "Though I should mention, the northern camera feed has been intermittent for the past 20 minutes. Maintenance flagged it as a routine glitch." Do-Hyun's grip tightened on the radio. "Send someone to check it in person, now," he said, already moving toward the hallway, Nadia rising quickly to follow him. The first gunshot came less than 90 seconds later, distant at first, then closer, followed by the sound of the estate's alarm system finally, belatedly, screaming to life. "They are already inside the perimeter," Park's voice reported, tight with controlled urgency. "The northern camera was disabled deliberately, sir. I am moving my men to intercept, but I need you and Nadia secured immediately." Do-Hyun grabbed Nadia's hand, pulling her toward the main staircase out of pure instinct, the same instinct that had guided him through 100 dangerous rooms over the years. But Nadia planted her feet, resisting him with surprising strength for an 11-year-old. "Not that way," she said urgently. "The main staircase puts us in view of the front hall windows for almost 10 seconds. If they have anyone positioned outside, we are exposed the whole time." "Where then?" Do-Hyun demanded. Gunfire now audible somewhere on the ground floor, closer than it had been moments earlier. "The servants' passage," she said, already pulling him toward a narrow door tucked behind the linen closet that Do-Hyun had walked past 1,000 times without ever once considering its purpose. "Ms. An showed me years ago, when I used to follow her everywhere. It connects to the kitchen without passing any exterior windows." Do-Hyun did not question her further. He had learned, at considerable cost, exactly what it meant when Nadia spoke with this particular certainty, and he followed her through the narrow door into a dim, cramped corridor that smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the kind of forgotten architectural space that existed in houses built generations before anyone anticipated needing to disappear inside their own walls. They moved quickly through the passage, Do-Hyun's gun drawn, Nadia pressed close behind him, her small hand fisted in the back of his jacket, exactly as it would be years later, in the moment that had opened this very story, though neither of them could have known that yet, living instead inside the raw, unresolved terror of the present moment. "Wait," Nadia whispered suddenly, pulling him to a stop just before a junction where the passage split in 2 directions. "What is it?" Do-Hyun asked, his voice barely audible. "I do not know," she said, her expression tight with concentration. "But we should not go left. I do not know why. We should not go left." Do-Hyun did not argue. He guided them right instead, and moments later, muffled through the thin wall separating the passage from the kitchen beyond, they heard heavy footsteps moving through the exact hallway the left branch would have led them into. At least 2 men, moving with the deliberate pace of people searching room by room. They reached the kitchen safely, finding it empty, and Do-Hyun pressed Nadia against the wall beside the door, listening carefully before easing it open. It was there, in the dim kitchen lit only by the pale glow of appliance displays, that they found Camille, crouched behind the center island, a kitchen knife gripped tightly in one hand, her expression fierce and focused. "You," Do-Hyun said, tension flooding back into his voice, old suspicion resurfacing instantly despite 11 days of carefully monitored visits. I am not with them, Camille said immediately, urgently, rising slightly from her crouch. I came tonight because I had a feeling, the same kind of feeling I imagine Nadia gets, though I have learned to trust mine considerably less over the years. I was in the garden when the shooting started. I came inside through the kitchen door because it was closer than running for help. Do-Hyun studied her for a long, dangerous moment, his gun still raised, years of hard-won caution warring against the urgency of the situation collapsing around them. She is telling the truth, Nadia said quietly, stepping slightly out from behind her father. I can feel it. She is scared the same way we are scared. That is not something you can fake. Not really. Not underneath everything else. Do-Hyun lowered his weapon slightly, though not entirely. We need to reach the panic room beneath the east wing, he said. Park has men engaging the intruders, but I am not leaving either of you exposed longer than necessary. I know a faster route than the main corridors, Camille said. Ines used to tell me stories about houses like this one, families like yours. Old estates always have more passages than the owners remember. I studied the blueprints Park's men allowed me to review before my first visit, purely for my own peace of mind. There is a maintenance corridor beneath the kitchen pantry that connects almost directly to the East Wing foundations. Show us, Do-Hyun said, decision made, and Camille moved quickly toward the pantry, pulling aside a false shelving unit to reveal a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. They moved together now, 3 of them instead of 2. Camille leading with the knife still gripped tightly in her hand, Do-Hyun covering their rear with his weapon raised, Nadia between them, her hand still fisted in her father's jacket, her head tilted slightly as though listening to something the adults around her could not fully perceive. Left, she whispered urgently as they reached another junction deep beneath the house. Then wait. Someone is close on the right path. I can hear it, boots, close. Maybe 30 seconds ahead of us if we had gone that way. They took the left path, and moments later, a burst of gunfire echoed distantly from the direction they had avoided. Followed by shouting, followed by silence. Park's men, Camille said quietly, listening. That sounded like an exchange, not a chase. They may have engaged whoever was covering that route. They reached the panic room 11 minutes after the first gunshot, sealing the heavy reinforced door behind them, and it was only then, in the sudden muffled silence of the small concrete room, that Do-Hyun allowed himself to lower his weapon fully, his hands shaking slightly with an adrenaline he had not permitted himself to feel during the escape itself. Nadia sank down against the wall, her earlier certainty finally giving way to visible exhaustion, the particular crash that came after holding steady through something too large for an 11-year-old to carry without cost. You did well, Camille said gently, crouching down beside her. Better than well, you got us here. Nadia looked up at her, something raw and uncertain in her expression. I did not know if you were one of them, she admitted quietly. Earlier, in the kitchen, I said I believed you, but I was not entirely certain. I just knew we did not have time to be certain. I understand completely, Camille said. I would not have trusted me either, given everything. Do-Hyun activated the panic room's internal radio, static crackling briefly before Park's voice came through, tight but steady. Sir, Park said, we have neutralized 4 intruders, captured 2 more attempting to flee the north perimeter. The house is being cleared room by room now. I need approximately 10 more minutes before I can confirm it is fully secure. Understood, Do-Hyun said, exhaling slowly for what felt like the first time in 11 minutes. Good work, Park. He looked between Nadia, still catching her breath against the concrete wall, and Camille, sitting close beside her now, with a protectiveness that Do-Hyun found he no longer had the energy or the inclination to question, and something in his chest settled, uneasily but genuinely, into a shape he had spent 11 years avoiding. You saved us tonight, he said, looking at his daughter. Both of you did. Nadia managed a tired, small smile. I told you the house was holding its breath, she said. You did, Do-Hyun agreed quietly. And I am going to spend considerably less time doubting you from now on, whatever it costs my pride to admit that out loud. They waited together in the small concrete room, the 3 of them, until Park's voice finally returned to confirm the house was secure, and when the heavy door finally opened again, revealing the damaged but standing hallway beyond, Do-Hyun found himself reaching first, not for his radio, not for his weapon, but for his daughter's hand, holding it steady as they stepped back out into whatever remained of the life they had built together. Morning arrived gray and quiet over the estate, the fog that had covered the attack the night before still clinging faintly to the grounds as Park delivered his final report in the study, the same room where everything had begun 11 years earlier. 4 intruders neutralized, 2 in custody, Park said, standing at attention despite the exhaustion visible in his posture after a night without sleep. We lost 1 man, sir, 2 others wounded, though both are expected to recover fully. The 2 we captured have already confirmed, under questioning, that they were sent by the Song family specifically to retrieve or eliminate the child, whichever proved more feasible once they were inside. Do-Hyun absorbed this in silence, standing near the window, watching the fog slowly burn away under the rising sun. And Camille's information, he asked finally, was it accurate? Entirely, Park confirmed. The maintenance corridor she led you through was not on any blueprint filed with the city. She must have genuinely studied the older architectural records I provided her, the ones from before the East Wing renovation 30 years ago. I do not believe she could have known that route existed, unless her intentions were exactly what she claimed them to be. Do-Hyun nodded slowly, something in his chest finally, fully releasing a tension he had carried since the night Camille first appeared outside his gate. Thank you, Park, he said. See that the wounded receive whatever they need, and extend my gratitude to every member of the team who responded last night. I will not forget what was risked to keep this house standing. Park nodded once and left, and Do-Hyun remained alone in the study for a long moment, before making his way toward the kitchen, where he found Nadia sitting at the table with Ms. An, a cup of tea untouched in front of her, and Camille seated across from them both, the 3 of them talking quietly in the particular hush that settles over a household after violence has passed through it and finally moved on. They looked up as he entered, and something in Do-Hyun's chest tightened at the sight of them together, at ease with one another in a way that felt, after 11 long years, like the first genuine image of family he had allowed himself to see clearly. "May I speak with you?" he said to Nadia, and she rose without hesitation, following him to the small study she had claimed as her own years earlier, now filled floor to ceiling with the careful, organized clutter of a childhood spent cataloging a dangerous world. She sat down across from him, waiting, her expression more open than guarded for once. And Do-Hyun found himself searching for words that did not come as easily to him as negotiations or commands, words he had spent 11 years actively avoiding. "I have been thinking about the night you were left at the gate," he said finally. "I told Choi, back then, that you were not my responsibility, that a dead man's daughter was not currency. I want you to know I remember saying that, and I want you to know exactly how wrong I was." Nadia said nothing, watching him carefully, giving him the space to continue. "I kept you out of obligation for longer than I am proud of," he said. "I told myself I was managing a debt, not raising a child. I missed birthdays I could have attended. I let other people teach you everything that mattered, while I stayed behind a closed door, telling myself that was safer, easier, more responsible somehow. And every single time it mattered most, you were the one who kept this family standing, not me." "That is not entirely true," Nadia said quietly. "You listened, eventually, every time. Even when it was hard." "Eventually is not good enough," Do-Hyun said. "Not anymore. I do not want you to grow up believing you are here because your mother left a note about a debt. I want you to know, clearly, from me, that you are my daughter, not an obligation I inherited, not currency someone tried to use against me. My daughter, chosen, every day, starting today, whether that choice was slow in coming or not." Nadia's composed expression finally cracked, something young and unguarded breaking through the careful watchfulness she had carried for as long as he had known her. "You have never said that before," she said, her voice smaller than he had heard it in years. "I know," Do-Hyun said. "I am saying it now, and I intend to keep saying it, as many times as it takes for you to fully believe it." She crossed the small distance between them and hugged him, fierce and sudden. And Do-Hyun, a man who had built an empire on controlled distance and careful calculation, held his daughter and did not let go for a long time. Later that evening, he found Miss An in the kitchen and Camille lingering near the doorway, uncertain of her welcome now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I owe you both an apology," Do-Hyun said, addressing them together. "Ms. An, you told me 11 years ago to look at her before sending her away, and I refused you. You have raised her more than I have, for most of her life, and I have never properly thanked you for that." Miss An's eyes glistened slightly, though her composure held. "You do not need to thank me, sir," she said. "You only needed to become the man standing in this kitchen tonight. That is thanks enough." Do-Hyun turned to Camille. "And you," he said. "I doubted you until the moment I could no longer afford to. I do not know yet what your place in this family looks like going forward, but I know it will not be a small one. If you are willing to stay close." "I am willing," Camille said quietly. "Then let us stop pretending 11 days of supervised visits is the pace this family needs anymore," Do-Hyun said. "You are her mother's sister. That makes you family, not a guest under observation." That night, for the first time in 11 years, Do-Hyun ate dinner at the same table as his daughter, without a single meeting pulling him away early, without a closed study door waiting to absorb his attention the moment the meal ended, and when Nadia laughed at something Ms. An said, easy and unguarded in a way he had rarely witnessed, Do-Hyun found himself laughing too, a sound that felt unfamiliar in his own chest, but not unwelcome. 3 weeks after the raid, the estate had settled into a rhythm none of them had known before. Quieter in some ways, fuller in others. The careful distance Do-Hyun had maintained for 11 years finally, deliberately dismantled. Camille had taken a small guest suite in the West Wing, no longer a visitor requiring supervision, but something closer to what Do-Hyun had promised that night in the kitchen. A permanent, welcomed presence woven slowly into the fabric of the household. She and Nadia spent afternoons together in the garden, Camille sharing fragments of Ines that Nadia had never had access to before. Small details, a favorite song, the particular way her mother used to laugh. Pieces of a woman Nadia had only ever known through a note and a bracelet, now finally taking shape as someone real. Do-Hyun found himself, more evenings than not, sitting on the terrace watching them together, a cup of tea going cold in his hands, something settled and unfamiliar living quietly in his chest where careful distance had once stood guard. Park had increased security across every division of the household, thorough but no longer paranoid, the particular calm of a man who had proven himself capable when it mattered most. The two captured intruders had given up enough information to confirm that this particular branch of the song threat had been dismantled, though Park had been careful, in his final briefing, to note that dismantled did not mean finished, not entirely, not for a family with as long a memory for grudges as the songs had proven themselves to carry. "There are still pieces of this we do not fully understand," Park had said. "Who exactly gave the order? Whether there are others connected to this who have not yet surfaced. I would not consider this closed, sir. I would consider it contained, for now." Do-Hyun had accepted that assessment without argument, understanding, perhaps for the first time fully, that a life built the way his had been rarely offered anything as clean as a true ending. On a quiet evening near the end of that 3rd week, Nadia found her father on the terrace and settled into the chair beside him without being invited, a habit she had never quite had the confidence for before, and Do-Hyun found he did not want to imagine an evening without it now. "Camille told me today that my mother used to stand outside in the rain on purpose sometimes," Nadia said, watching the sun set slowly over the grounds. "She said it made her feel like the world was paying attention to her, even when nobody else was." Do-Hyun considered this quietly. "That sounds like someone I would have liked to have known," he said. "I think she would have liked you too," Nadia said. "Eventually. Once you stopped being so difficult about everything." Do-Hyun laughed, the sound still unfamiliar but growing easier each time it surfaced. "I am working on that," he said. They sat together in comfortable silence as the light faded fully from the sky, father and daughter, chosen now rather than merely kept, with a found family slowly taking root around them in ways neither of them could have predicted 11 years earlier. In the rain, at a gate neither of them yet fully understood the meaning of. But somewhere beyond the estate walls, in rooms neither of them could see, the people who had sent 4 men through that gate were already asking questions about what had gone wrong, and why, and what it would take to try again. If you want to see what comes next for this family, and who from the Song family is still watching from the shadows, let me know in the comments below. And if this story kept you here until the very end, make sure you are subscribed, because this family's story is far from over.